it is with great pleasure that I introduce a person who from the time he left Vietnam to today has not ceased in being a leading activist in the anti-war movement and will play that role if this war and as this war heats up. Ron Kovic, born on the 4th of July.
I've come here tonight to tell all of you that this fight is just beginning, and that if President Bush goes to war in the Mideast, then we are going to battle on the streets of this country until we bring that peace. Because we are not going to allow what happened in Vietnam to ever happen again. We will not allow that to ever happen again. We will not allow another wall in Washington to have the names of 50 or 100 or 150,000 young American boys for a war that is being fought for corporations, profit, and oil. We will not allow that to happen either. And we must begin to fight back now, not only to bring the boys home, but to build a new America, to create a new democratic movement tonight here in this place, to begin a movement for all the people, and not only every American man, woman, and child, but every human being in every country. We must begin to build a new nation. And tonight I call you to build that new nation, to be a part of that new movement, to join with us and create a more beautiful country and a more beautiful world, to build bridges of friendship to other peoples and to other cultures, not to kill or to maim or to make enemies, but to learn to love and to care for and to respect life, to respect the life of Eric Larson. Would you stand up, Eric? Eric Larson is a Marine who will not go to war. And Mr. President, we are just beginning. Thank you very much.
I'm 18 years old and a junior here at Cal. And in order to pay for my education, I have had to receive financial aid like many other students. Well, in order to receive financial aid, you must be registered with Selective Services. Well, if a war was to break out with Iraq, I honestly don't believe it would be a Panama or Grenada. It would last a long time, and in all likelihood, I would be drafted. So I would be sent off halfway around the world to kill and, in all probability, die in order to secure the vested economic interests of the United States and its allies. To tell you the truth, the prospect of giving my life to ensure the safety of $1.10 a gallon is not all that appealing, especially since I don't have a car. A war with Iraq would cost the lives of so many young U.S. men and women, as well as the countless numbers of Iraqi men, women, and children that you never hear about. And it's very appalling to me to hear the Bush administration and all of his military strategists talk about lives as statistics, as just numbers rather than individuals and people. It's okay. That's what I have at stake, and a lot of other people my age. We are the ones that are sent. We, the young people of this country, didn't start this war. However, we are the ones that are forced to fight them. We want to stop a war that will trade the lives of many people in exchange for the security of cheap oil. So please, let's bring the troops home now.
We are being sent into a war of plunder, and this is a war that working people will pay for dearly. In the earliest days of this war, the U.S. sent over some of the troops on Eastern Airlines, despite the fact that the International Association of Machinists has been carrying out a hard-fought 18-month strike against Eastern Airlines. Now, this was a rude slap in the face of organized labor that should wake them up. Our unions need to take a stand against the war and be a part of the opposition to stop it now.
The brief letter I'm going to read extends apologies for this person not being able to be with us, and then he concludes, "Let me then unite with the common voice you will raise to let it be known that we cannot sit idly while our government, 1, deploys military force solely to guarantee the free flow of oil to the United States, 2, introduces into the area offensive military weapons which are capable of launching attacks against Iraq, and 3, blockades food, medicine, and other humanitarian aid, thus using innocent civilians as pawns. We cannot allow the winds of war ominously stirring in our land to silence the voice of moral responsibility required of peoples who pride themselves on the rights of citizen participation." And it is signed, the Archdiocese of Detroit, the Bishop Thomas J. Gumbleton.
Imagine, if you will, a scenario where a large country decides that its strategic interests have been threatened by a small country. And these interests it defines as being both political and economic, and that they're so great and so important that it decides it's going to invade. And in the process of invading the country, it tries to justify it by saying, well, this country was ruled by authoritarian leaders, and that because of that, the decision to invade was legitimate. The question is, am I talking about the United States or Iraq? Am I talking about Panama or Kuwait? It's clear from recent history, not just a few months ago in Panama, but if we go back a little bit further to U.S. policy in Central America and Grenada as well, that for the United States to claim moral leadership on the basis that it upholds international law and respects the sovereignty of small nations is nothing short of hypocrisy. While none of us would support or in any way condone the action of the Iraqi government in taking over Kuwait, I don't hear too many people saying that that was right. What is highly questionable is the right of the United States to play policeman of the world and declare when it's okay to invade and when it's not okay. It's real clear to a lot of us that what's at stake in the Middle East is not the sovereignty of the Kingdom of Kuwait, but oil. Just as much as in Panama, the real issue was not whether or not Noriega, who had been a trusted ally of the United States, was involved with drug dealing, but really who would control the Panama Canal. We have to start to expose and educate the American people about these interests, these geopolitical interests which guide U.S. foreign policy. Because until we begin to expose the fantasy, we can't begin to change the priorities of this country. I saw a bumper sticker on my way here tonight that read, "Do we fear our enemies more than we love our children?" And it was very fitting to me because this buildup that's taking place in Iraq and the potential war that's about to occur represents our peace dividend that some of us hoped would begin a process of rebuilding devastated communities in our country that have been allowed to languish over the last 10 years. in the midst of this patriotism that's going to be generated to justify a war that will kill many people in the Middle East, once again, issues related to poverty and hunger and homelessness and no support for public education and public health will be back burner issues, non-issues. This is more than just a peace movement that's needed. We need a movement that begins to redefine America's priorities. And particularly because we can't hold up Saddam Hussein and say, he's okay, don't hit him, leave him alone. We can't do that. But we can say, that's not our priority. That's not where our money should be spent. That's not our role in the world. Our role is to provide another course, a course that shows that we care about our own people, all of them. That example will give America a new moral leadership and one that I think many of us are waiting for. Thank you.
Forgive me this evening for demonstrating my lack of expertise on Middle Eastern affairs. My fields are ethnicity and Latin America. I am grateful for the opportunity to lend an additional female perspective to this great panel. I do have some very serious questions about the Middle East that I'm sure many of you share with me. First, who does Saddam Hussein think he is? Teddy Roosevelt? And what is Hussein trying to get away with this naked aggression? Is he trying to put in place his own Monroe Doctrine? We can't let him think that might makes right, as Bush says, and that he can unilaterally attack a small, helpless nation. Before you know it, he might attack Grenada and take over their tourist airport, or mine the harbors of Nicaragua to make the people say uncle, or invade Panama to solve his nation's drug problems. No, might is never right. Don't misconstrue my remarks here tonight as support for Saddam Hussein. I think he is a barbarian for using chemical weapons in his war with Iran and against his own ethnic Kurds within his borders. His actions can be likened to another barbarian who dropped atomic weapons on innocent non-combatants in 1945. I would like to say that I don't think his invasion of Kuwait can be put on the same level as his use of such chemical weapons. We have to deal with other matters besides the tremendous hypocrisy of the Bush administration and Hussein's desire to do unto others as the U.S. does unto others.
Before I was put on trial, I was in Vietnam. I'd been in the Defense Department. I'd been in the Rand Corporation. So that's to say, I've been wrong before. Let me speak very briefly here to and for the people in the American public, and maybe a couple in this audience, who are still capable, after all this time, of being fooled by an American president, at least once every 20 years or so. Can you hear me? Not you, I'm talking about these people who are dumb enough to listen to an American president a couple of weeks ago, or I should say over a month ago now, who heard an American president describe a policy of responding to an aggression, a real aggression. Not, on this occasion, an American aggression, like Vietnam or Panama or Libya or Grenada, but respond to an aggression in company with the UN by a UN-sponsored economic embargo and boycott and blockade, again, eventually sponsored by the United Nations, and by a deterrent force in company with the majority of the Arab League, it appeared, to deter further aggression by Saddam Hussein, who had just committed aggression, who had done so years before in Iraq, in Iran, and seemed quite possibly and postured to do so again. I'm talking now about those Americans who listened to that and said, that's the first American foreign policy, certainly the American intervention, I can support in a very, very long time. I was one of those, and I may be in a very small minority in this group, but I know I'm not alone in that. I believe that the majority of the American people who support this policy, that is, the majority of the American people, are deeply misled as to the nature of that policy, and they believe that it's just, if any of you read the Tony Lewis piece recently, applauding, which was quoted, I think, by Carlos Munoz, they're applauding a policy which is not the policy of the United States right now, deterring aggression to the extent that that may be a real risk in Saudi Arabia is not the purpose of the last 100,000 or so American troops, men and women who've been poured into that country, or the heavy tanks or the planes that have been crushing over there, or of the next 100,000 that it's on its way and will arrive within the next several weeks, thereby building up a posture which is now increasingly openly described as an offensive posture. Every day that passes with new troops that go over there means an increase in a highly costly investment, both in money and even more in prestige, American prestige, but perhaps most critically, presidential prestige that can only be redeemed by a victory in the Middle East. Ousting of Saddam Hussein, the overthrowing of his regime, the disarming. These are aims that can only be achieved by a combat use of the forces that are being sent over there. That war would be catastrophic, it would be tragic in every dimension, political, diplomatic. It would lose us all the support in the world. It would preclude both Arab and non-Arab. It would preclude any of the positive aims that some people have hoped for from this UN collaboration at this point. If there is war, it is overwhelmingly likely that it will be war that the U.S. has initiated, perhaps by some incident like one that I experienced in the Pentagon, the Tonkin Gulf incident, which I exposed in the Pentagon Papers, an exaggerated, miscalculated, or provoked or hoped up incident that appears to justify our going into war. We must prevent that war. The lesson we must draw from Vietnam is that it must be averted. There must be no Tonkin Gulf, no Persian Gulf incident, no Tonkin Gulf resolution, no Persian Gulf resolution, a blank check from Congress. If they do that to us again, they must all be fired or impeached. There must be no Persian Gulf memorial in Washington, D.C., or Cairo, or Tel Aviv, or Damascus, or Baghdad. Thank you.
On April 21st, 1986, I joined the Marine Corps to defend the American dream, which first attracted my parents to this country in 1958. I emerged from boot camp 3 months later, a fully indoctrinated fighting machine, willing to go anywhere in the world to defend the ideals and freedoms stated in the Constitution of the United States of America. I first became aware of the realities, though, of U.S. foreign policies through student activists in the Bay Area. They introduced me to alternative newspapers and books and exposed me to the writings and speeches of Oscar Romero of El Salvador. My eyes were open to American history of U.S.-sponsored exploitive policies motivated by corporate and personal greed. You can say I had a conversion experience. How can you not be converted when 70,000 Salvadorians have been killed over the last 10 years as a result of U.S. policies? I realized that I could no longer blindly follow orders from my commander-in-chief, but that my actions were accountable ultimately to a higher authority. My ethical and moral convictions has led me to declare my opposition to the escalation of tensions and seemingly inevitable war in the Middle East. It sickens me to hear that 40,000 of my fellow reservists and 80,000 of my active duty brothers and sisters are going to wage war in the Middle East to protect our American lifestyle. Oil imports could be cut in half if a sound energy policy focusing on renewable resources and conservation was in effect. Now, what's the answer our environmental president proposes? He proposes that we keep our tires inflated and drive the speed limit. Well, bullshit! It's our oil-consuming Western lifestyle that is destroying the earth, and it's our wasteful society that has brought us to the brink of a preventable war. Our presence in the Middle East has destroyed any hope of any of us ever receiving a peace dividend. We are wasting over $30 million a day in Saudi Arabia, while our inner city school systems are in shambles, while homeless people still walk the streets, and while the S&L criminals are still on the loose. In the words of Marine Corps Major General Butler, two-time recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor, war is a racket. It brings in profits to the oil companies and Wall Street flag wavers, while the cost of the operation is always transferred to the people who do not profit. Let's take the dollar signs out of the battle flags and send the troops home. Now, I've spent 3 long months in boot camp to learn to view human beings as targets, as ragheads, as gooks. It has taken me almost 3 long years to begin to see people as human beings once again, and I'll be damned if I'm going to be part of this racist, militaristic feeding frenzy. We are not the policemen of the world. This is not our problem, and it seems we are making it into our problem. Let's get out of the Gulf and send the troops home. I will refuse orders to activate me into the regular Marines. I will refuse orders to ship me to Saudi Arabia to defend our polluting lifestyle. I will refuse to face another human being with a gas mask covering my face and M16 drawn. I am no longer a Marine. I am a conscientious objector to war. No war for big oil. 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 Send the troops home. Send the troops home. I hope that my statement tonight may somehow wake up the American people. I hope that it won't take body bags with some of my buddies stuffed in them to get the people mobilized. Tonight, you've heard the truth. Now it's time to fight the lies of the government. It's time to agitate. It's time to educate. And it's time to organize.
These etchings are my motivation for mobilizing to stop a war in the Middle East. They're taken from the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall, the Black Wall, in Washington, D.C. They're the names of friends of mine, men from my platoon in Vietnam, young lives wasted in a foolish war. It's true, we all need to learn more about the Middle East, but we can't let our need for information leave us sitting at home. That's analysis paralysis. You remember what we've learned from Henry Kissinger's memoirs. Richard Nixon was always watching the public, the peace movement, even when he pretended not to be. George Bush is no different. There's a very good chance of offensive action by the United States in the Middle East in the next few weeks, in the next few months, as the Pentagon builds up its forces in that area. They're already stockpiling body bags in Saudi Arabia. Experts estimate U.S. casualties of 10 to 20,000 for starters, not to mention the tremendous civilian loss of life in those Arab countries. If you share our concerns, contact us here at Operation Real Security. We're working with Sane Freeze, the Campaign for Global Security, which is the largest peace organization in the United States, with other national organizations like 2020 Vision, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and with hundreds of groups in communities all over the United States. If you write to us here at Operation Real Security, we'll send you a resource kit with all the information you need to put on a teach-in like the one you've seen tonight in your own community. It includes a petition, which is the part of a very exciting drive calling for an end to the U.S. involvement in the Middle East. We'll also send you a made-for-TV professional advertisement, a 30-second spot featuring Ron Kovic, which you can spend a small amount of money for to put on your own local TV station to bring attention both to Ron and other leaders speaking out against the war, and also to your own local efforts to organize to prevent this intervention. We'll even send you a mini grant, up to $200 as long as our funds last here at Operation Real Security, to support your local organizing on this issue. Here are some of the ways in which you can get involved. To prevent a war with Iraq, do something right now. Go around this room and make personal commitments to act. You can call or write your member of Congress. Write a letter to the editor. Plan a local teach-in on the Iraq crisis. Organize a vigil at a recruiting office. Copy this tape and hold a house party for your friends. If you can only do one thing, call 900-446-4765. With only one phone call, you can join our National Action Network, request the resources you need, generate a personal letter to your member of Congress automatically, and help pay for this video, all for only $4.95 on your phone bill. Or write Operation Real Security, 2076 East Alameda Drive, Tempe, Arizona, 85282.
Don't miss these additional, extremely important speeches on this tape. Daniel Sheehan, Chief Legal Counsel of the Christic Institute, on the plot to maintain the military-industrial complex. Professor Khalil Baroum of Stanford University, on an Arab American's view of the crisis. Dick Roberts, expert on Mideast oil, on the history of oil acquisition and politics. And finally, Brian Willson, Vietnam veteran and peace activist, on coming to terms with the American way of consumption. These follow immediately.
In 1988, Mikhail Gorbachev unilaterally dismantled the Warsaw Pact, and that in 1989, the United States military-industrial complex was basically suffering from apoplexy and trying to figure out how they could justify a continuing $315 billion a year military budget. A major internal study has been done by Professor Michael Clare from Hampshire College and Amherst and University of Massachusetts in Vassar, that college combine in Northeast. He has been analyzing the internal communications that have been going on in the White House and the Pentagon, and he had discovered that as of the spring of 1990, a major debate had broken out within the administration between two basic camps. The first camp had advocated that we go the way of Germany and Japan, that we make dramatic cuts in the military budget, that we use the federal taxes to invest in the economic capital infrastructure of the United States, retool our industry, modernize our industry, and attempt to compete, and to do this to cut back dramatically on military spending. There was, however, an opponent group, a group that had advocated a massive maintenance of military spending, to develop a highly mobile tactical Delta force, to develop capacities they called low-intensity conflict capacities, for new mobile fighting machines in transport, in weapons, and to develop the covert operational ability to neutralize threats. Now, what Professor Clare has come to conclude, very importantly, is that by May of 1990, now this is months before the August actions by Saddam Hussein, that this group had achieved the ascendancy within the executive branch. And they had developed and had written white papers that were going inside the administration, advocating a new rationale for a massive U.S. military. And this was, and this is what the white paper says, to provide a military shield to protect the Western industrial world's access to strategic raw materials against third world threats by use of low-intensity warfare tactics. And in this white paper of May of 1990, the name of Iraq and Saddam Hussein were set forth in May of 1990 as the optimum contender to replace the Warsaw Pact as the justification for major military expenditure. and it proposed that he be dealt with through low-intensity conflict tactics. Now, this becomes very interesting because in June and July, there is some circumstantial evidence to indicate that there may very well have been a major central intelligence agency and intelligence support activity undergone by the Pentagon of covert action to remove Saddam Hussein from his position of leadership. The August 19th Washington Post, it says, on August 10th, at the Arab Summit Conference in Cairo, Kuwait's foreign minister, Sabah Ahmad Sabah, confronted Iraq's foreign minister, Tariq Aziz, publicly accusing Iraq of an unprovoked aggression in violation of international law. And Tariq Aziz, the foreign minister from Iraq, pointed to the Kuwaiti foreign minister and said, "You beware. We possess and will reveal to the world the contents of your conversations and documents and communications between the Kuwaiti Foreign Ministry and the United States Central Intelligence Agency, and of your plans to take steps to deal with Saddam Hussein." And the foreign minister of Kuwait fainted dead away and passed out on the floor of the Cairo Summit Conference. And what we discovered is that immediately after the incursion into Kuwait on August 2nd, that Thursday, on Friday, the Senate Intelligence Committee secretly brought to the floor of the United States Senate a Senate Bill 2834. It was brought to the Senate floor at 3:30 a.m. when there was not a quorum in the Senate. There were at most 10 senators even in attendance at the Senate at that time. And they put this bill onto the floor, 2834, which specifically authorizes, for the first time in history, the United States President to formulate, initiate, and prosecute covert operations without any prior communication to the United States Congress. It also specifically authorizes the President to use any federal agency, not only the Central Intelligence Agency or the National Security Council, but the Internal Revenue Service, the Drug Enforcement Administration, any federal agency to undertake covert operations. Thirdly, it authorizes the President to utilize funds that have been appropriated by the United States Congress to those federal agencies for other purposes to be used for covert operations, without the necessity of notifying the United States Congress before initiating those programs. And it then goes on to authorize the President to utilize private parties, such as Richard Secord, Albert Hakim, Jack Singlaub, and the others, to carry out covert operations for the United States. And it states that if, in fact, in the President's judgment, there are sensitive matters, that he need communicate this information to the United States Congress only at the time, in a timely manner that he deems appropriate. Now, this was an extremely interesting move on the part of the Intelligence Committee, and there was a voice vote taken, and it was registered as unanimously approved by the United States Senate at 3:30 a.m. on Saturday, August 4th. I suggest that you get right on the phone, starting as soon as you can, to your congressmen and senators, and you tell them that Senate Bill 2834, the section on oversight, Title VII, has to be opposed. It has to be eliminated from the Senate bill. It cannot be included in the House of Representatives bill. And I request from the Christic Institute that you move very rapidly on that.
I'm really glad that Jeff did think about including an Arab American, a real flesh and blood Palestinian American at that. Because if war does break out, and I hope it doesn't, God forbid, then Arab Americans are going to be torn between their adoptive country and the people who sent them over here because these people over there are going to be doing the dying. Let me start by quoting Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell in his questioning of Oliver North during the Iran-Contra hearings. He says, "It's possible for people to disagree with you, Colonel North, and still just be as patriotic Americans as you are." End of quote. I too direct these words to those who might be tempted today to think that dissent from the administration's policy on the Gulf makes Americans less patriotic or loyal to this country. In the public opinion polls taken on the Gulf crisis, many people suspect these polls are right, and they say that 25% of the American population is demanding a peaceful resolution to the conflict and calling for an end to American military intervention there. Unfortunately, however, just by watching the coverage on network TV, you will not be able to tell that there is 1/4 of the American population who are opposed to what seems to be an avoidable war in the Middle East. As a matter of fact, if you happen to be a first-time visitor to this country, you would probably think that the TV networks are all state-owned. For we are constantly inundated by a parade of present and former government officials who want us to believe that the war with Iraq is going to be short and sweet. But what Alexander Haig, Jeane Kirkpatrick, and Dick Cheney, among others, do not exactly address is what's in it for us average Americans, and how is it in our interest to enrage and antagonize millions of Arabs across the Arab world. Initially, we were told that we were going to Saudi Arabia to protect the Saudis against an imminent Iraqi attack. Then we were told that we were there to ensure the withdrawal of the Iraqi troops from Kuwait. And now we're being told by people who have made a living out of Arab and Muslim bashing, both in government and in the media, that nothing short of a full-scale war to overthrow Saddam Hussein is acceptable. Therefore, William Safire, for instance, has his wish list of what to do to make Iraq uninhabitable. And others like Senator Alphonse D'Amato of New York weigh in with their own advice on the futility of negotiations and the glory of war. The question is, where were these characters when Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982? And where have they been for the past 23 years while Israeli occupation has continued to devastate Palestinian land and people? Or are we to believe that not all occupations are equal? It's time for us to expose the American government's hypocrisy and double standard for what they are. It's time for us to tell the administration that if constructive engagement was advisable with South Africa, then why not with Iraq? It's time to remind the administration that Israel's occupation of Arab land has lasted 23 years, and the administration has not yet run out of patience for diplomacy. The socio-economic and political concerns of the Arab people in the Arab world have no military solution. Military interventionism is not the answer. We believe that the U.S. is better off cultivating friendship and trust of the Arab people through cooperation, not confrontation, through diplomacy, not gunboat policy, and through negotiations, not military intervention. What's at issue here is not whether Saddam Hussein is to stay or go. After all, haven't we learned anything from history? We tried the same trick in Iran in 1953 when we toppled a popular Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. And look at our relations with the Iranian people now. The Arab world is not our enemy. And the sheikhs and princes of the Arab Gulf who have no credibility with the people of their own region are not our friends. Our military intervention on their behalf and on behalf of the big oil companies serves no purpose except to heighten the resentment of the Arab people against an American Middle East policy that is already perceived there as both hypocritical and morally bankrupt. Our policy in the Middle East should take into consideration the human needs and the political and economic aspirations of the Arab people there. It should not be based solely on short-sighted economic interests. Our alliances in the Arab world should not be with feudal landlords and in behalf of oil companies, for neither one is worth dying for. And neither, I might add, is a shining example of either democracy or egalitarianism. Finally, the oil sheikhs of the Gulf will disappear one day, and even will their oil. But the Arab people and their resentment of our heavy-handed policy will always stay, I'm afraid. That's exactly what we are worried about in this crowd and outside this room. And that's exactly why I am a new war against American military intervention in the region. Thank you very much.
Jeff asked me to fill in some of the background, and so that we all know that oil is involved, but what are some of the facts behind it? Marguerite mentioned that these countries, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait, were colonial countries. They were colonies of Britain after World War I, and one of the central issues for Britain, for Churchill, who led the colonial wars on this, was to get oil. Oil had already been discovered in Iran and Iraq. So oil is central to this thing all the way back to the beginning. The boundaries that are today under dispute were actually first drawn up by a British High Commissioner of Iraq in 1922. Kuwait wasn't even present, but one of the things that he did do that's important for us to know today was he put that Kuwait in there to make Iraq a landlocked nation. Britain ended up, as you might remember, with all of the colonies in that area. Egypt, Iraq, Iran, all of these countries were British colonies. It was not able to get total control of the oil because during World War II, the United States, France, the Allied powers had made secret agreements that they would also be allowed to get into these markets. Well, there was oil there, and it took them actually 6 years, from 1922 until 1928, to come up with an agreement over who would own the oil in the Middle East. That agreement in 1928, the famous Red Line Agreement, gave the oil of Iraq to France, to the United States, to England, and to Holland, not to the Iraqi people at all. The negotiations continued. Kuwaiti oil was finally divided up in 1932. There, 50% of the oil went to Britain and 50% went to the United States, mainly to the Gulf Oil Company. By 1935, the United States had enough clout to actually get all of the oil of Saudi Arabia. Until 1974, 1974 wasn't so long ago. Until 1974, the oil of Saudi Arabia was 100% owned by Exxon, Texaco, Mobil, and SoCal. We need to know that to understand the poverty of these countries. Those of you that are experts on Latin America and other countries know about the one-crop economy. Well, this is what you have here. Iraq depends for 95% of its income from exports on oil. Kuwait's 99%. In Kuwait, there's only 1% of the land that is under agricultural production, which is one of the reasons why this so-called food embargo is so punitive now. These countries remained in poverty. They did not own the oil. Now, when it finally was nationalized in the 1970s, it's been pointed out that it did not go into the hands of the people. It went into the hands of the emirs, the sheikhs that the British and the Americans had been dealing with all these many years. Now, Saudi Arabia is a special case because it's such a wealthy country as far as ownership of oil is concerned. And there are very close relationships. I'm sure the Christic Institute has lots more information on this than I'll give you right here, but these ties have been going on for some time. Saudi Arabia is the #1 purchaser of weapons from American companies. Boeing, Lockheed, all these companies, they have very big major contracts in Saudi Arabia. The California construction firms of Bechtel and Fluor have built these huge, as they did in Vietnam, build these huge air bases and things like that in Saudi Arabia. And officers of Bechtel, like George Shultz, who was the Secretary of State under Reagan, and Caspar Weinberger, who was the Secretary of Defense, come straight out of Bechtel and represent those Saudi Arabian connections. Saudi Arabia helped the CIA out a little bit when it came under pressure, financed the CIA's war in Afghanistan, gave a lot of money to the Contras. Let's look at OPEC for just a second. OPEC was formed by the oil-producing countries to try and keep up, once they got a hold of the oil, this is not till the 1970s, to try and gain resources to develop their countries. And I say that because if Venezuela or Mexico or in Iraq wants higher oil prices to develop those countries, I think we got to bite the bullet. The United States consumes 25% of the oil produced in the world. You know, let's think about the balance of resources this represents. Now, it's different if Saudi Arabia is selling oil cheap to Exxon, and Exxon is selling it expensively to us. That's the relationship that's actually developed in the 1980s. You see, OPEC was unable to do that. It could not maintain high oil prices because as the world economic conditions got worse, prices of oil dropped. Anybody here from Texas? You know all about it, right? Texas, the Southwest, oil wells aren't going right now as we talk. There are oil wells in those states that aren't being used because as the price of oil dropped, they got more and more hooked into the oil of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. And that's the situation that really exists, this linkage of the oil companies and these very wealthy emirs and sheikhs in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. And I think we've got to be clear on that because it's behind the whole thing. Saudi Arabia, throughout the latter part of the 1980s, has been developing refineries, all of the mechanisms to become a major oil producer and forget about OPEC. And this was clearly an economic threat to countries like Iraq. The Saudi policy became more and more tailored to this cheap oil scheme that I've already described. What about the oil situation? I just mentioned that there's oil wells in Texas and Southern California, in the Southwest that aren't even being used. The discovered and known oil reserves in the United States and Alaska are larger than the oil reserves in the Middle East. The undiscovered reserves are huge. But in the United States, we seem to be wedded to a principle. One of the commentators on the crisis made the remark, I think it's worth thinking about. The principle we seem to hold most dear is 18 miles to the gallon. Japanese citizens use about 1/3 as much oil as their American counterparts. We don't need that oil physically. Who needs the oil? The people in Exxon and Mobil, the people in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. This very important understanding is what we've got to do. Jeff asked me to just briefly touch on these things so you could go back and go farther into it. Let me just end by saying something that I am so thankful for this meeting. If you go back to the early days of the anti-war movement in Vietnam, and many of us were there, nothing like this happened until the war had been going on for 5 years. 5 years before the first teach-ins. And look at this wonderful audience, and we're all thinking about these things. We're talking to each other. We're learning from each other. I think that bodes very well for us and not so good for them. Thanks a lot.
Immediately I was appalled when I heard about our latest intervention in the Middle East, and I started studying, like I always do, about what it is the United States is doing here and there and everywhere. But then it occurred to me again, why is it that we've intervened militarily in over 200 countries in 200 years of our existence? Why is it that we violated 400 treaties with the Native Americans? What is it about us that has been so devouring of other human beings, both in this country and around the world, and the resources on the land and under the land? We have a big problem. We have a very serious problem. In this country and in the Western world in general, we're very, very greedy. We have an insatiable desire to consume and to live very comfortable materially at the expense of almost everybody else. I call it AWOL, AWOL, the American way of life. It's a violent assault, a threat on all life on this planet, and it represents the Western life in general. The average American family affects the environment 40 times greater than a family in India, 100 times greater than a family in Kenya, for example. 5% of the world's population consuming approximately half the world's resources. The rich nations' per capita consumption of oil is 15 times that, the consumption per capita in the poor nations. We have this insatiable desire that if you're in our way, we'll kill you. We did it to the natives. We built our nation on slavery and exploitation and domination, and we continue to do that today. We have a problem, and it's your problem and my problem. I don't know how else to explain why it is we keep finding justifications to intervene everywhere. We always have a reason, an explanation, to make us look good and somebody else to look bad. And I don't buy it anymore. I just won't buy it. It's always been a lie in some very fundamental way. And so I think we need to consider whether we want to survive as a species or whether we want to commit suicide. If we want to survive, I think we have to be experiencing within ourselves and in our community and our nation a revolution. A revolution of our consciousness, our values, a revolution in how we perceive ourselves in relationship to all other species and all other people. We are not superior to other people, and yet we've acted that way for the duration of our country's history. I'm a recovering white male. It's very difficult. It's very hard. But I don't see any other way, because I want to live, I want to love, I want to be at peace, and there's no peace without justice. And there's no justice when 5% of the people consume half the world's resources. It's impossible. And so we need to change. We need to help each other experience a transformation. We need each other to do that. We need to be in the streets. We need to be expressing ourselves from our hearts about truth, about our interconnectedness, about sharing and caring, instead of hating and consuming at somebody else's expense. It's going to be hard. We're all conditioned and used to living in a way that requires other people to die for our way of life. And the redwood trees, too. Because they're all commodities. So I hope that this Middle East crisis will reveal to us, in a way maybe no other intervention has, how raw, how imperial, how crass our policies are, not cloaked any longer by anti-communism or pro-democracy. This is just plain raw imperialism. And we are consuming more oil than we did, of course, 20 years ago. We don't need to consume all that we're consuming. And that's the only thing I can add to what's been said here tonight, that we need to look at our whole history and understand why it is we have continued to force other people to die for some kind of idea of what the good life is. The good life for us is a terrible life for most of the rest of the planet.